a man searching for the truth disappeared, leaving behind only questions, secrets, and a trail that nobody wanted to follow.
But the deeper we searched, the more we discovered. This was never one crime. It was a system built on secrets. Behind the wealth, behind the reputation, behind the perfect image, someone was hiding the truth. Every hidden file revealed another secret. Every secret brought us closer to the people who thought they were untouchable. In the end, every secret leaves a mark, and every lie eventually meets its witness.
Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel, The Silent Witness. Here, we share crime stories, mysteries, and haunting real-life cases.
If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss the next part of these stories or our upcoming new videos.
Some investigations begin with a phone call. Others begin with a single document. Hamza Rahman's investigation began with a question that nobody else wanted to ask. Hidden beneath Nurabad's booming construction industry was a trail of forgotten financial records, abandoned warehouses, and people who had disappeared without explanation. As the city slowly came to life, Hamza unknowingly stepped closer to a conspiracy that had remained buried for years. Every step toward Lyrie Heights brought him closer to a truth that powerful people would do anything to keep hidden. From a distance, the warehouse looked forgotten. Years of rust and neglect suggested it had been abandoned long ago. But Hamza noticed details that didn't belong. Fresh tire tracks crossed the cracked concrete. New security cameras overlooked empty loading bays. Powerful generators quietly hummed behind locked steel doors. Someone had invested significant resources into a building that officially no longer served any purpose. Hamza carefully photographed every angle, unaware that hidden cameras were already recording his presence. What seemed like an ordinary warehouse would soon become the center of the largest investigation Nurabad had ever seen. Every city has people who appear untouchable. Rashid Karim was one of them. To the public, he was a respected businessman whose investments transformed abandoned neighborhoods into modern developments. Newspapers praised his generosity. Politicians welcomed his donations. Investors trusted his reputation without hesitation. But behind polished speeches and expensive boardrooms, another story was quietly unfolding. Hamza's research suggested that Rashid's success had been built upon a complex network of hidden companies, mysterious land acquisitions, and financial transactions that disappeared before anyone asked difficult questions. The deeper the investigation went, the more impossible it became to separate legitimate business from carefully concealed deception. While Nurabad slept, another side of the city came alive. Private meetings replaced public ceremonies. Deals worth millions were discussed far from government offices and financial institutions. Luxury yachts became floating conference rooms where conversations remained beyond the reach of ordinary surveillance. Hamza had unknowingly photographed one of these late-night gatherings weeks before his disappearance. At the time, the images seemed ordinary. Later, investigators would discover that several individuals attending this meeting were connected through dozens of shell companies responsible for suspicious property transfers across the city. It was the first visual clue that powerful people were operating together behind carefully protected layers of wealth and influence. Hours turned into nights as Hamza compared financial statements, property records, shipping logs, and forgotten court files. Every new document pointed toward the same invisible network, yet no single piece of evidence revealed the complete picture. Then an anonymous message appeared among his research. It contained only a short warning that someone already knew he was asking dangerous questions. Instead of stopping, Hamza worked even harder, believing he was closer than ever to exposing the truth. He didn't realize the warning was not an attempt to scare him away. It was the final chance someone inside the conspiracy had tried to give him before events moved beyond anyone's control. Every document revealed another hidden connection. Land ownership records changed hands again and again, always ending with companies that appeared unrelated on paper. Hamza slowly realized the money itself wasn't the mystery. The land was. Entire neighborhoods had quietly changed ownership, while official records disguised the true buyers behind layers of shell corporations. The closer he looked, the more carefully organized the deception became. Whoever designed this financial network had spent years making sure nobody would ever see the complete picture. Hamza believed he was the one collecting information. In reality, someone else had already started collecting information about him. His daily routine, the cafes he visited, the streets he preferred, even the warehouses he photographed were quietly being documented. Every investigation creates two stories, one told by the investigator and another written by those determined to protect their secrets. By the time Hamza realized he was no longer alone, the people watching him already knew exactly how close he had come to discovering the truth. Weeks after Hamza vanished, investigators returned to one of the locations he had secretly documented. Beneath the abandoned textile factory, they discovered something nobody expected. Hidden below the cracked concrete floor lay reinforced underground chambers built years after the factory officially closed. Inside were destroyed records, damaged computer equipment, and thousands of shredded documents. Although someone had tried to erase every trace of the operation, modern forensic techniques slowly reconstructed the evidence. Piece by piece, the hidden archive began revealing the true scale of the conspiracy Hamza had been chasing. Behind expensive suits and polished conference rooms, a hidden organization quietly controlled millions in assets. Investigators would eventually call it the Circle because every financial trail, every property deal, and every suspicious transaction eventually returned to the same small group of influential decision-makers. Publicly, they appeared as successful developers and respected investors. Privately, they built an empire protected by secrecy, legal complexity, and carefully manufactured identities. Their greatest defense was not violence. It was making the truth almost impossible to understand. The final confirmed sighting of Hamza Rahman lasted only a few seconds. Security cameras captured him entering Dock Sector 7 shortly after sunrise, carrying the same backpack that contained months of investigative work. He walked with purpose, unaware that every movement was being watched. Minutes later, the cameras recorded nothing unusual. No struggle, no obvious crime, only silence. By the following morning, his phone had stopped responding, his apartment remained empty, and one of Nurabad's most determined investigative journalists had seemingly vanished without leaving a trace. His disappearance would become the catalyst for an investigation that exposed years of hidden corruption and changed the city forever. Less than 48 hours after Hamza Rahman's disappearance, the investigation entered unfamiliar territory. Acting on newly recovered records from his apartment, Detective Sara Malik obtained a warrant to search a warehouse that had appeared repeatedly throughout Hamza's notes. Hidden behind rusted machinery and a reinforced steel wall, investigators discovered a concealed underground archive untouched by ordinary inspections. Every shelf contained years of carefully organized financial ledgers, shipping manifests, property deeds, and encrypted storage devices. Nothing inside looked abandoned. Instead, it appeared as though someone had left in a hurry only days earlier. As forensic photographers documented every inch of the chamber, Sarah realized this wasn't merely a hidden office. It was the operational memory of an entire criminal organization. Every document connected another company, another property, another unexplained financial transfer. The conspiracy Hamza had spent months investigating was no longer just a theory. It had become physical evidence. Yet among thousands of files, one section stood completely empty. A row of missing storage boxes suggested someone had returned shortly before the police arrived, removing only the records they considered most dangerous. The question was no longer whether Hamza had uncovered the truth. The question was whether he had learned too much before disappearing without a trace. The evidence recovered from the underground archive filled an entire forensic laboratory. Every ledger, every damaged storage device, and every handwritten note was photographed, cataloged, and examined with extraordinary care. Digital specialists worked around the clock to recover deleted files, while forensic accountants compared thousands of financial transactions with government property records. At first, the information seemed overwhelming, but gradually a pattern emerged. The same companies continued appearing under different names. Land changed ownership through layers of shell corporations before returning to businesses secretly controlled by the same small group of executives. It was an elaborate system built to hide the true source of wealth while disguising the movement of millions in illicit funds. Then one discovery changed everything. Among hundreds of accounting books, investigators found a gap in the numbering sequence. Every ledger before and after it was present, except one. According to inventory records, Ledger 47 should have documented 6 months of financial activity during the period Hamza had focused on most intensely. Someone had removed it with remarkable precision, leaving no obvious sign that anything was missing. Detective Sara Malik believed the missing ledger wasn't taken for its financial value alone. It likely contained the names of the people who had secretly directed every major operation inside the organization. As digital reconstruction continued, fragments of deleted emails began to reappear. Most were routine business correspondence, but a handful referenced coded shipment numbers that matched locations Hamza had visited during the final weeks of his investigation. Suddenly, his movements, the missing ledger, and the hidden archive no longer appeared to be separate mysteries. They were parts of the same, carefully planned operation. Somewhere beyond the documents and encrypted files, someone still possessed the missing piece of the puzzle, and investigators knew that finding it could finally expose the leadership of the circle before they disappeared forever. The missing ledger pointed investigators toward one final location repeatedly referenced in Hamza Rahman's recovered notes, a shipping container that appeared in multiple transport records but never completed an official customs inspection. According to the reconstructed database, the container had entered Dock Sector 7 under one registration number before quietly leaving under another. No record explained why. Rather than immediately seizing the shipment, Detective Sara Malik ordered discreet surveillance. For 2 nights, nothing unusual happened. Trucks arrived, paperwork was processed, and cargo moved through the harbor with ordinary efficiency. Then, shortly after midnight on the 3rd evening, activity suddenly changed. A container listed as carrying industrial machinery was moved away from the main loading area and into a section of the dock that appeared inactive on official maps. Hidden behind stacks of cargo, investigators watched as workers carefully opened the container. Instead of machinery, they discovered locked filing cabinets, computer equipment, and sealed archive boxes being transferred into an unmarked truck. Every movement appeared organized and deliberate, suggesting someone was attempting to relocate sensitive records before authorities could find them. Without revealing their position, investigators photographed every vehicle, every worker, and every identifying mark. One license plate matched a transportation company already linked to Rashid Karim's financial network. The evidence confirmed their growing suspicion. Even as investigators closed in, members of the circle were still trying to erase the final traces of their operation. The race had become a battle between those uncovering the truth and those determined to make it disappear forever. The surveillance operation at Dock Sector 7 provided investigators with something they had been missing for months: a destination. By tracking the unmarked truck from a safe distance, detectives watched it travel through Nurabad before disappearing into an isolated industrial district on the outskirts of the city. The building it entered had no company sign, no active business registration, and almost no public records connecting it to anyone. On paper, it was an abandoned storage facility awaiting demolition. In reality, it appeared to be one of the final operational locations still controlled by the Circle. Just before sunrise, Detective Sara Malik obtained an emergency search warrant supported by the newly collected surveillance evidence. The tactical team surrounded the property from every direction while forensic specialists prepared to preserve whatever might still remain inside. As officers entered the building, they immediately noticed signs of a hurried evacuation. Coffee cups were still warm. Computer monitors had been switched off only minutes earlier. Half-packed document boxes lay scattered across the floor. Several external hard drives had been smashed with heavy tools in an obvious attempt to destroy evidence before investigators arrived. Although much of the equipment had been damaged, the raid was far from unsuccessful. Digital forensic experts recovered fragments of deleted security footage from a hidden backup server concealed behind a false electrical panel. The video revealed members of the organization transporting confidential records, encrypted laptops, and sealed evidence boxes through the building over several weeks. Most importantly, investigators identified a recurring symbol stamped onto every archive box, a small circular emblem that perfectly matched the mysterious mark found on Hamza Rahman's handwritten notes. For Detective Sara Malik, The discovery confirmed what she had suspected from the beginning. Hamza had not stumbled onto isolated acts of corruption. He had uncovered the operational headquarters of an organization that had spent years hiding behind respectable businesses, complex financial structures, and carefully manufactured identities. Yet despite the success of the raid, one fact remained painfully clear. Someone had warned the organization again. Once more, its leaders had escaped only minutes before the authorities arrived. The investigation was closing in, but the final confrontation was still ahead. The safe house raid produced dozens of clues, but one encrypted navigation file led investigators to the most heavily protected location uncovered during the entire operation. Hidden beneath an abandoned government records building was a secure underground vault designed not to store valuables, but to preserve information powerful enough to control an empire. Every shelf contained meticulously labeled archive boxes documenting years of property transactions, offshore transfers, coded shipping, records, confidential agreements, and internal communications between senior members of the Circle. Unlike previous discoveries, nothing here had been hastily abandoned. The files were arranged with extraordinary precision, suggesting this vault served as the organization's ultimate insurance policy. As Detective Sara Malik and her forensic team carefully cataloged each document, an extraordinary picture began to emerge. Separate investigations that had remained unsolved for years suddenly connected through common financial signatures, shared legal intermediaries, and synchronized property transfers. Every recovered ledger strengthened the same conclusion. The organization had survived not through brute force alone, but by exploiting bureaucracy, corporate secrecy, and public trust. The conspiracy had been carefully engineered so that no single participant understood the complete operation. Even those involved had seen only fragments of a much larger machine. Among hundreds of evidence boxes, investigators recovered a sealed envelope bearing Hamza Rahman's initials. Inside was a handwritten investigative outline, incomplete but unmistakably authentic, summarizing months of independent research into the network's hidden structure. Rather than accusing individuals outright, Hamza had mapped relationships between companies, financial movements, and suspicious redevelopment projects, believing that following the evidence, not assumptions, would eventually reveal the truth. His final notes stopped abruptly, ending with one unfinished sentence beneath a hand-drawn network diagram. For Detective Sara Malik, that unfinished page became more than evidence. It became the final thread connecting every stage of the investigation. The financial records, hidden archives, coded shipments, and anonymous warnings were no longer isolated mysteries. They formed a single narrative, a fictional conspiracy built upon deception, fear, and carefully concealed wealth. Standing inside the underground vault, surrounded by years of recovered evidence, the investigation reached its turning point. For the first time since Hamza disappeared, the task force possessed enough verified material to reconstruct the entire fictional network from beginning to end. The truth had not surfaced through a dramatic confession or a single breakthrough. It had emerged slowly, one document, one ledger, and one overlooked detail at a time, exactly as Hamza had always believed it would. With thousands of recovered documents finally organized, Detective Sara Malik asked her team to stop looking at individual crimes and instead examine the investigation as one complete timeline. Every warehouse lease, every land transfer, every shell company, and every encrypted communication was carefully placed onto a single digital evidence board. As new connections appeared across the screen, investigators realized they were no longer following scattered clues. They were looking at the complete blueprint of a fictional criminal empire. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Whenever a redevelopment project began, unusual financial transfers followed. Whenever valuable property quietly changed ownership, anonymous companies appeared only long enough to complete the transaction before disappearing forever. Months later, the same addresses resurfaced under different corporate names. What once looked like unrelated business activity was now revealed as one carefully coordinated system designed to conceal the true movement of money and influence. Then one of the forensic analysts noticed something unexpected. Hidden inside the metadata of several recovered files was the same anonymous user identification number. It appeared across documents created years apart, suggesting that one unknown individual had quietly recorded nearly every major decision made within the organization. Whoever this person was, they had never appeared in bank records, company registrations, or public documents. Yet their digital signature connected every stage of the fictional conspiracy. Sara believed the anonymous archivist had never intended to lead the organization. Instead, they had silently documented its operations from within, preserving records that others desperately tried to erase. The investigators suddenly realized that someone inside the network had become its unwilling historian, the silent witness whose hidden archive had allowed the truth to survive. Outside, thunder echoed across Nurabad as another storm rolled in from the sea. Inside the investigation room, years of deception were finally beginning to collapse under the weight of their own records. The final phase of the fictional investigation had begun, and for the first time, Detective Sara Malik believed they were no longer chasing shadows. They were closing in on the last remaining architect of the circle. Beneath the abandoned harbor records complex, investigators discovered another level hidden behind a reinforced maintenance corridor that did not appear on any architectural blueprint. The concealed room housed a compact but highly sophisticated server facility powered by an independent backup generator. Unlike the paper archives found upstairs, this location had been designed to preserve digital information. Although many systems had been remotely wiped before investigators arrived, several storage arrays remained intact because their network connection had failed during the final shutdown. Forensic specialists immediately began creating secure forensic copies of every surviving drive. As recovered data slowly appeared on their screens, a detailed digital timeline emerged. Years of financial transactions, coded project names, encrypted planning documents, and internal operational records were connected through one central database. The fictional organization had documented almost everything, not out of carelessness, but because its leaders believed no outsider would ever gain access to the archive. Among the recovered files, Detective Sara Malik noticed a directory labeled Project Echo. Unlike the other folders, it contained no financial records. Instead, it held surveillance photographs, investigation summaries, and internal risk assessments about journalists, auditors, and whistleblowers who had come dangerously close to exposing the fictional conspiracy. Every file ended with the same anonymous digital signature that investigators had identified only hours earlier. Whoever maintained this archive had quietly preserved the complete history of the organization while leaving behind clues that could eventually expose it. The investigators realized they were no longer simply reconstructing past events. They were following the work of an unseen insider who had been documenting the downfall of the fictional empire from within. Somewhere beyond the servers and encrypted files, that person might still be alive, and they might possess the final piece of evidence capable of bringing the entire conspiracy to an end. Less than 24 hours after investigators recovered the hidden server archive, Detective Sara Malik received another anonymous message through a secure government tip line. It contained nothing more than a location, a time before sunrise, and a warning that no surveillance team should follow. Every instinct suggested it could be a trap, yet the pattern matched earlier anonymous leads that had consistently guided investigators toward genuine evidence. Arriving at the deserted railway station before dawn, Sara found no waiting witness. Instead, resting quietly on an old wooden bench was a sealed envelope and an encrypted flash drive. Before anyone could approach, a distant figure briefly appeared through the heavy morning fog and disappeared beyond the abandoned platform without looking back. The encounter lasted only a few seconds, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note containing only one sentence. The records explain how the organization worked. This explains why it survived. The flash drive contained copies of internal communications between senior members of the fictional network. Rather than discussing financial transactions, the files described methods used to compartmentalize information so that no single participant understood the entire operation. Every department handled only its own responsibilities, making it nearly impossible for outsiders, or even insiders, to reconstruct the complete structure. One recovered document stood apart from the others. It described a contingency plan called Final Lantern, intended to permanently dissolve the organization if its leadership believed exposure had become inevitable. According to the fictional plan, assets would be redistributed, shell companies dissolved, digital records erased, and senior members instructed to disappear under new identities. Detective Sara Malik immediately understood the urgency. The investigation was no longer just uncovering the past. It had become a race against time to preserve the remaining evidence before the fictional organization erased itself forever. The discovery of the final Lantern documents changed the direction of the investigation completely. For months, Detective Sara Malik and her team had been searching for evidence that explained how the fictional organization operated. Now they had something even more important, a warning of how the organization planned to disappear. The investigation moved faster than ever before. Every remaining company connected to the Circle was placed under continuous review. Digital analysts monitored financial activity, while legal teams prepared emergency orders to preserve critical evidence. Investigators understood that the next few hours could determine whether years of hidden information would finally reach the public or vanish behind another layer of secrecy. Inside the command center, every screen represented a different piece of the puzzle. One displayed property records. Another showed financial movements. A third tracked the locations of individuals connected to the network. For the first time, investigators could see the entire structure at once. But the operation carried a serious risk. The fictional organization had survived because it always reacted before anyone could stop it. Whenever pressure increased, records disappeared. Companies closed. Employees vanished. Evidence changed locations. The same strategy that had protected them for years could still be used one final time. Sarah studied the investigation board covered with years of evidence. She knew the case was no longer about discovering whether the conspiracy existed. That question had already been answered. The real challenge was proving every connection beyond doubt and preventing the remaining leaders from escaping accountability. As the final operation began, investigators moved carefully and silently across Nurabad. Behind every closed office door, every abandoned warehouse, and every forgotten account was a piece of the truth. The fictional empire built on secrecy was finally facing the one thing it had never prepared for. The moment when all hidden information became visible at once. The final operation began before sunrise. Across Nurabad, investigators moved toward locations that had remained untouched for years. Offices that once represented success and influence became evidence scenes. Luxury buildings that had hosted private meetings were transformed into places where forensic teams carefully collected every document, every computer system, and every remaining trace of hidden activity. For the first time, the fictional organization known as the Circle could not hide behind complexity. The same network that had protected itself through layers of companies and anonymous transactions was now exposed through thousands of connected pieces of evidence. Inside one corporate headquarters, investigators discovered the final operational records of the organization. Unlike earlier files, these documents revealed internal disagreements among members who had once appeared united. As pressure increased, trust inside the group had collapsed. The people who built the system of secrecy had begun protecting themselves from one another. Financial analysts continued tracing the movement of assets while legal teams secured emergency orders preventing the transfer of remaining funds. Digital specialists recovered deleted communications showing that senior members had attempted to activate the final Lantern plan only days before the investigation reached its final stage. But their plan failed because the evidence had already been preserved. The anonymous archive, the hidden servers, the recovered ledgers, the forgotten documents. Every attempt to erase the past had created another trail, leading investigators closer to the truth. Standing inside the command center, Detective Sara Malik watched as years of hidden activity were transformed into a complete case file. The fictional empire that once appeared impossible to challenge was finally beginning to collapse under the weight of its own secrets. The Circle had survived because it believed information could be controlled forever. But information has a dangerous quality. Once the truth escapes, it does not need permission to spread. The collapse of the Circle had begun, but investigators knew the final chapter would not end inside an office or a courtroom. One question remained unanswered. Who had designed the organization's escape plan, and who was still attempting to protect its final secrets? The recovered digital files revealed one last location connected to the anonymous administrator behind the hidden archive. It was an abandoned coastal facility outside Nurabad that had been inactive for years. Official records showed no ownership, no employees, and no reason for anyone to visit the location. Yet the investigation database showed repeated encrypted connections originating from the site. Under the cover of a violent storm, Detective Sara Malik and her team approached the facility carefully. The area appeared deserted, but small details suggested recent activity. Fresh tire marks crossed the muddy ground. A security light flickered near a damaged entrance. Inside, investigators discovered that someone had recently accessed the building and removed several storage devices. For a moment, it appeared the final evidence had disappeared. Then Sara noticed something hidden behind an old maintenance panel. Unlike the other evidence that had been taken, this small device had been deliberately left behind. It contained a complete timeline of the circle's rise, internal conflicts, and eventual collapse. The final message inside the device was not a confession. It was a record of events created by someone who believed the truth deserved to survive. The investigators finally understood that the person behind the archive had never been trying to save the organization. They had been preparing its downfall. As the storm continued outside, Sara looked across the empty facility and realized the investigation had reached a turning point. The last secret had been uncovered, but the consequences of those secrets were only beginning. The final archive did not reveal a single dramatic secret. Instead, it revealed something far more powerful. The complete truth hidden beneath years of carefully created identities. For years, the Circle had survived because it understood one simple idea: confusion protects secrets. The organization created countless companies, changed ownership records, moved assets through complicated channels, and separated responsibilities so that no single person could see the entire structure. Every layer was designed to make the truth disappear inside paperwork. But investigators now had something the Circle never expected: time. Every transaction, every document, every communication, and every hidden file had created a permanent record. What had once looked like meaningless fragments now formed a complete story. The evidence showed how ambition, greed, and the desire for control had slowly transformed ordinary business operations into a fictional network built around secrecy and deception. Detective Sara Malik spent days reviewing the final evidence report. She noticed that the most important discoveries were not the expensive properties or hidden accounts. The most important discoveries were the small details people ignored: the repeated signatures, the overlooked documents, the forgotten backups, and the quiet actions of the anonymous insider who preserved the truth. The investigation became a reminder that powerful systems are often defeated not by force, but by patience and attention. The people behind the Circle believed their influence made them untouchable. They believed money could erase mistakes, and complexity could hide responsibility forever. But every hidden decision leaves a trace. Every forgotten record has a story, and eventually, someone will find it. As the final evidence boxes were sealed and transferred into official custody, Nurabad entered a new chapter. The fictional empire built on secrecy was gone, but the lessons left behind remained clear. Wealth can create an illusion of power, but truth has a way of surviving even in the darkest places. Months after the final evidence was recovered, the investigation moved from hidden archives and abandoned locations into a public courtroom. For the first time, the entire story of the Circle was presented in one place. Not through rumors, incomplete reports, or scattered suspicions, but through verified evidence collected over the course of the investigation. The courtroom became the final battlefield between explanation and accountability. The defense attempted to separate the individuals from the organization, arguing that the network was too complicated for anyone to fully control. But prosecutors presented the evidence differently. They showed the repeated patterns, the shared financial structures, the coordinated decisions, and the hidden communication systems that connected every part of the fictional operation. One by one, the pieces came together. The underground archives, the encrypted servers, the missing ledger, the anonymous records, the financial trails. Each discovery represented a different moment when someone had believed the truth could remain hidden forever. Detective Sara Malik watched silently as years of investigation were transformed into a clear timeline. She remembered how the case had started, with unanswered questions and a missing piece of information that seemed impossible to recover. Now those questions had become evidence, and that evidence had become a complete record of how the fictional organization had operated. The most powerful moment of the trial did not come from a dramatic confession or an unexpected revelation. It came from the simple presentation of thousands of small details that proved impossible to ignore. The circle had depended on secrecy. It had depended on confusion. It had depended on people believing that complicated systems could never be understood. But justice did not need to understand every illusion. It only needed to follow the truth. As the courtroom waited for the final decision, everyone understood that the downfall of the circle was not caused by one mistake. It was caused by years of believing that power could replace honesty and that wealth could permanently silence questions. Long after the courtroom proceedings ended, Detective Sara Malik returned to the place where the fictional organization had once appeared strongest. The headquarters tower that had represented influence, wealth, and control now stood almost completely empty. The expensive offices, once filled with important meetings and confident decisions, had become silent rooms holding only memories of a system that had collapsed. Walking through the abandoned executive floor, Sara noticed something unusual. There was no dramatic destruction, no obvious sign of defeat. The downfall of the circle had not happened with explosions or public chaos. It had happened quietly, through documents being uncovered, lies being challenged, and evidence refusing to disappear. The empty offices revealed a powerful lesson. The organization had spent years building an image of permanence. Its leaders believed the buildings, companies, and wealth surrounding them were proof that they could never fall. But those things were only temporary symbols. The foundation beneath them was built on deception. Among the remaining files, Sara found one final personal note from the anonymous archivist who had preserved the evidence. It did not contain names, accusations, or explanations. Instead, it contained a simple reminder that the truth often survives through ordinary people who choose not to ignore what they see. The investigation had changed many lives. Some people lost careers. Some lost fortunes. Others were forced to confront the consequences of choices they had made years earlier. But the greatest change was invisible. Nurabad had learned that powerful systems are not defeated only when someone stronger appears. They are defeated when enough people stop accepting silence. As Sara looked across the empty city skyline, she understood that the story of the circle was not only about corruption and betrayal. It was also about responsibility. Because every secret depends on someone protecting it. And every truth begins when someone decides it is finally time to reveal it. Years later, the story of the circle remained one of the most complex fictional investigations in Nurabad's history. It was not remembered because of the wealth that disappeared or the powerful names that fell. It was remembered because it proved something far more important. Truth does not always arrive with a dramatic moment. Sometimes truth appears slowly. It appears through forgotten documents stored in old rooms. Through a single person who refuses to ignore suspicious details. Through investigators who continue searching even when answers seem impossible to find. The fictional empire built by the circle was never destroyed by one person or one discovery. Its downfall came from thousands of small pieces of evidence that eventually formed a complete picture. Every hidden transaction, every altered record, and every attempt to erase information created another path leading back to the truth. Detective Sara Malik knew that justice could not undo every consequence of the past. Lives had been affected. Trust had been damaged. Years had been lost. But exposing the truth created something that deception could never create: accountability. Standing above Nurabad as the sun rose over the harbor, Sara looked at the city differently. The streets below were the same. The buildings were the same. But the people had learned a lesson that would remain long after the investigation ended. Power without honesty is fragile. Wealth without integrity is temporary. And secrets protected for too long eventually become the evidence that reveals everything. The final chapter of The Circle was not a story about criminals winning or losing. It was a story about choices. The choice to hide. The choice to stay silent. And finally, the choice to reveal the truth. Because in the end, every shadow has a weakness. And every hidden story eventually finds its witness.